In 1945, American President Roosevelt met with Soviet Premier Stalin at Yalta to discuss the post-war world. Yalta is on Russia's Crimean peninsula, where tens of thousands of Russians had recently perished fighting the invading Nazis. Both leaders would be stunned to learn that 70 years later, American leaders would insist that Crimea does not belong to Russia, and to hear a White House spokesman proclaim that World War II was a war between the United States and Ukraine against Nazi Germany and Russia.
Meanwhile, it's known that Ukraine itself has mixed views on this ideology. Why aren't we condemning Ukrainian manifestations of Nazism and continuing to sponsor it?
79 years ago, the United States and our Ukrainian allies joined forces to combat the oppressive regimes of Hitler and Stalin. While Berlin is now an ally, the threat from the East persists. That's why we're committed to standing by Ukraine and offering our full support in any way we can.
America's corporate media is closely controlled so that their reporting supports the American empire. 6 massive media companies control 90% of the American market. Reporting guidelines are sent from a secret cabal to news editors, then down to so-called journalists. A clear example is that every reference to the start of the current war in Ukraine states it was unprovoked. One can debate if Russian intervention was justified, but it was clearly provoked. An example of a clear provocation appeared on CNN in 2014, before the CIA sent out its media guidelines for this war.
So this war began back in 2014, and it meant for the people in the Donbass, the people who were fighting this new U.S.-backed coup government, that they were being bombed regularly by the Ukrainian government. And there was a time when actually outlets like CNN reported honestly about this. You would never see this now. So now in this current war, we don't see coverage in the U.S. pretty much ever of how the people of the Donbass are being bombed with our weapons and suffering a lot. But this began a long time ago, back in 2014. So this is a look from back in 2014, how CNN used to cover this war in the Donbass. And it's very different to how CNN would cover it now.
Petro Poroshenko will have a hard time winning back hearts and minds in this city. As the people of Donetsk sweep up the debris of their homes and livelihoods, they are hardened against a president they say is killing his own people. We are Ukrainian, but they kill us, this man says. So we probably need our own country, because these people in Kiev, they are not brothers for us. The shells hit these homes days ago, but the tears are still fresh.
We live on the ground. It was so hard for 2 weeks, especially for 27, 28, 29th. But only today it's quiet. Sorry, I need to go.
2 people were killed outside this block of flats last Wednesday. One of them was a 50-year-old woman, the other a 34-year-old woman. Her husband, who won't talk to us, he says he's in shock, managed to make it down to the cellar with their little child, but she just didn't have the time. And this is a story that repeats itself over and over in dozens of apartment blocks, with civilians being killed by the constant shelling around Donetsk. The city's trauma hospital is filled with the civilian wounded, shrapnel embedded in the flesh and bone of market sellers' legs, the broken limbs of pensioners far too old to run. There was one war, and this is the second war, this old lady tells me. I was born in 1940 in World War II, and I will probably die before this war is over. Valentina Popova in the next-door ward lost her leg and her arm to indiscriminate artillery shells. Switching to the Ukrainian language, she makes a heart-rending plea to the president. We used to dance, sing, do everything in Ukrainian, she says. Poroshenko, Mr. Poroshenko, please listen to us. Why don't you understand your people? Be a man, be human. Please stop your aggression. Stop this war. But there is little sign of that. This once thriving city is now half empty, its railway station bombed. The forces unleashed by this conflict, greater perhaps than Mr. Poroshenko can control.
And so now we know what happened. When they signed the Minsk Accords, rather than use those accords as a basis to end that war and stop bombing these people, they used it as a smokescreen to continue the war for another 8 years, which then led to Russia's invasion. And that's the kind of reporting that isn't done anymore in U.S. media because it's too inconvenient to the narrative of this proxy war.
Since the end of the Cold War, Western scholars spoke often about the need to partition Russia into smaller states that Western corporations can easily control. This has been cited by Russian President Vladimir Putin as evidence of a serious threat to Russian security. His statements are denied by Western leaders and dismissed as Russian paranoia. But the truth sometime emerges, like in 2024, when Estonian Prime Minister Kaja Kallas mentioned
Russia's defeat is not a bad thing because then there could be really a change in the society and there are many different nations right now part of Russia as well. I think if you would have more like small nations, it's not a bad thing if the big power is actually much smaller. So
this. Soon after direct Russian military intervention in Ukraine in early 2022, NATO launched a massive information war, formerly known as censorship and propaganda. Russian news sites were blocked from the internet, as well as many small independent Western sites. Corporate propaganda was most that all Americans encountered. So they learned,
can Ukraine win?
Yes. Putin has failed. And he continues to fail.
Putin has already lost.
Putin's already lost the war.
Putin has already lost this war. I want to say that, and I want to say it loudly.
Putin has already lost in terms of what he was trying to achieve.
In many ways, Putin has already lost.
And that is Russia has already lost this war.
In short, Russia has lost.
A few small independent news sites continue to provide honest reporting, while truth-tellers like Professors David Siegel, Jeffrey Sachs, and John Mearsheimer appeared on some news shows to upset Americans with the truth.
I think it's important to note that the U.S. sanctions on Russia did not begin 2 years ago. That's the common framing now in the media. The sanctions on Russia started in 2014 under Barack Obama, and they were continued under Donald Trump, and they were now obviously ratcheted up significantly after 2022, after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. But the U.S. sanctions on Russia began after Russia annexed Crimea in March 2014. So we're nearing like the 10-year anniversary. At the time, this was seen as a radical kind of U.S. move. And it was pretty clear after a few years that they were not changing Russian behavior. The stated objective at that time was to get Russia to withdraw from Crimea and give up its territorial ambitions there. Obviously, Russia did not do that. In 2018, former Ambassador Daniel Fried, who was an architect of these sanctions under the Obama administration, was taking questions at a Senate hearing and defended the sanctions as working based on the logic that even though Russia was not withdrawing from Crimea, it was preventing Russia from taking more aggressive measures that it otherwise would take if sanctions were not in place. And he specifically said that if we had not imposed sanctions on Russia, they would have invaded Ukraine and conquered all of Ukrainian territory. That was in 2018. What's happened? Sanctions were continued under the Trump administration. It clearly did not prevent Russia from invading Ukraine, in 2022. Now the United States has ratcheted up those sanctions. There's enormous sanctions on Russia at this point. And as you said, it seems to be having, not only is it having no political effect, but I think actually what's really interesting and novel is that they're also having no economic impact. That's different from other cases of sanctions. Russia has been able to very skillfully navigate through these sanctions, building new trade alliances with China and India, Iran, basically the BRICS countries. It's getting off the dollar, it's separating itself from the US financial system, and it's still able to survive. Its oil revenue remains the same. Its economy, as you noted, the IMF actually predicts that Russia's economy is going to grow by 2.6% in 2024. It's going to be, that would make it the leading country in all of Europe. And when the sanctions were first imposed in 2022, I mean, after the full-scale invasion of Ukraine, we were told that the Russian economy was going to collapse. A lot of those same people are now saying, oh yeah, Russia's economy is growing, but the only reason it's growing is because it's spending so much on the military. And the rationale of the sanctions was precisely so that Russia was not going to be able to spend money on the military. It's like the logic of the experts is constantly being rewritten. And it's pretty clear, actually, what all of this means is that the United States is losing its economic influence and is not able to shape the events at a global level as it has been able to do since the end of the Cold War.
Nothing that's happening now is a surprise or even a shift from the underlying trend that has been underway now for 2 years. After all, Ukraine was completely bloodied and failed in its so-called counteroffensive last summer. It already lost significant areas, Bakhmut and others, in the spring of last year on its key defense lines in the Donbass. So what's happening now, which is dramatic, is not a surprise, and it's not even a decisive change of direction, except in the Western media.
I think, as somebody who covers free speech and censorship and debates adjacent to it quite often, one of the most extreme things I've seen in, let's say, the last 5 years, maybe even the last decade along those lines, is that the EU, just a couple of months into this war, made it illegal to give a platform to any Russian state media, such as RT or Sputnik. So if you as an American adult or a European adult, more specifically, more accurately, wanted to hear what the Russian media was saying, wanted to hear what the Russian government's version of events was, not to believe it, but just to have the comparison, hearing both sides, it was basically a crime to platform them. And the platform that our show is on, which is Rumble, is actually banned in France as a result of their refusal to remove RT and Sputnik. And so this information bubble was deliberately cultivated, and I think did quite an effective job in propagandizing the citizenry, to the point probably a lot of people are shocked that Russia actually is doing so well. Now, one of the arguments that war proponents are making, because war proponents in the United States never admit error. There's never a moment where they say, our predictions about the war didn't come true, it was misguided, it was an error, we made a lot of false assumptions. What they're now trying to say is, yes, Russia is winning, but the reason for that is that the Republicans held up the $60 billion package for so long in Congress, namely for about 3 months. And if you go back in history, you look at every war where the U.S. failed in its objectives, and they always make that same argument. Oh, we were constrained by war opponents. We would have won in Vietnam had it not been for the protest movement. We would have won in Iraq had they unleashed more force. We would have won in Afghanistan had we stayed longer. We would have won in Syria had Obama not tied the hands of the CIA. That's obviously what they're saying now. As you said, the evidence of Ukraine's failures predate by a long time the Republican impediment for a couple months or 3 months of the $60 billion package. But what do you make of that argument? What's your response to it?
First, let me say a word about the European bubble, because I lived in Vienna for much of last year. I was completely shocked. Even when I was scheduled to give a public address or an interview, sometimes the venues would cancel because they didn't want to hear an independent, objective, scholarly assessment. They were afraid, that is too much pro-Russian. I'm pro-peace, by the way. I'm pro-truth.
And you want to remember that if you look at what's happening in the conventional war, it looks like Putin's going to win, despite the fact that we've now passed this large-scale arms package for Ukraine. Putin is likely to win.
Why is that not a terrible thing for America and the West?
Because you have to prioritize the threats that you face in the world. And the fact of the matter is that what happens in Ukraine does not matter that much to the United States. I know for people like you, this is a life and death matter. The thought of any country on the planet that the West defends losing is a major defeat and has catastrophic consequences. I mean, you felt this way about us pulling out of Afghanistan.
I come from the Crimea conference with a firm belief that we have made a good start on the road to a world of peace. Never before have the major allies been more closely united, not only in their war aims, but also in their peace aims. And they're determined to continue to be united with each other and with all peace-loving nations, so that the ideal of lasting peace will become a reality. Peace can endure only so long as humanity really insists upon it and is willing to work for it and sacrifice for it. 25 years ago, American fighting men looked to the statesmen of the world to furnish the work of peace for which they fought and suffered. We failed them. We failed them then. We cannot fail them again and expect the world to survive again.